Roadworkers in Dorset, England, broke into a disused Roman quarry in 2009 and pulled out 54 skeletons, all male, all young, mostly late teens to mid-20s, and every single one of them had been decapitated. The heads had been removed from the front rather than the back, which means each of these men watched the blade coming toward his face. Some of them required multiple blows to finish the job. Their bodies had been dumped into the pit, but the skulls were stacked in a tidy pile off to one side, as if someone had been keeping count, and 3 skulls were missing entirely, most likely carried home as trophies. Isotope analysis confirmed Scandinavian origins, and several of these skulls bore horizontal grooves filed into the front teeth, a well-documented Norse fashion choice. These men had decorated their smiles for a world that ended up decapitating them. They were Vikings executed on English soil around the year 1000. And here is the uncomfortable part. Getting beheaded by the Anglo-Saxons ranked among the faster exits available in the Viking world. Being born into that world rather than arriving as a raider opened up ways of dying that were slower, stranger, and far more creative. Freezing ranked high on the list. Starvation came close behind. Parasites you never knew you carried could eat you from the inside. A tooth infection might spread into your skull and kill you over weeks. A complete stranger could challenge you to a legal duel, and refusing that challenge meant social annihilation. Outlawry could strip you of every legal protection and leave you surviving alone in the wilderness for decades, the way the Icelander Grettir Asmundarson endured nearly 20 years before someone tracked him down and killed him on a cliff island. Or you could simply suffocate in your own home because the air inside a Viking longhouse contained 130 times the particulate matter that the World Health Organization considers safe for human lungs. That is what a single night in the Viking Age actually looked like. And you, with your central heating and your grocery store and your antibiotics, would not have survived it. The thing that would have killed you first is the cold. The Viking Age runs from 793 to 1066, which overlaps with the medieval warm period, a phrase that sounds reassuring until you learn what warm actually meant. Summer temperatures in southern Greenland during this period averaged about 10 degrees C, which is 50 degrees F, and that represented the good version. A 2019 Northwestern University study found the region sat only about 1.2 degrees warmer than the centuries surrounding it. And a 2023 tree ring analysis of 188 Scots pines, published in Nature, concluded the medieval warm period had been not as warm as previously thought. What the thermometer actually read in northern Norway, where real Vikings lived and worked and fought, was degrees C in deep winter. Degrees FC Karasjok in Finnmark holds a modern record low of -51, and tree ring data from northern Sweden reveals cold snaps during the mid-10th century that pushed conditions even further down. Behind all of this lurks an older and deeper catastrophe. Not back-to-back volcanic eruptions in 536 and 540 C, centuries before the Viking Age began, dropped temperatures across Europe by 1 to 3 degrees, and triggered the late antique Little Ice Age, which ground on until roughly 661. Scholars Bo Graslund and Neil Music Price have argued that this event may have inspired the Norse myth of Fimbulvetter, the Great Winter, a prophecy of 3 successive winters with no intervening summer that heralded the end of warmth itself and the arrival of Ragnarok. The Vikings did not merely fear the cold. They built their apocalypse around it. What degrees does to the human body is straightforward and fast. Dr. Robert Glatter of Lenox Hill Hospital estimates hypothermia onset at that temperature in approximately 10 minutes. Water conducts heat 25 to 30 times faster than air, which means falling into a fjord or stumbling off a ship brought unconsciousness in 15 minutes and death inside 90. On dry land, in darkness, without shelter, your body becomes nothing more than a warm object radiating heat into a system that will never return any of it. Darkness compounded everything. Tromsø in northern Norway experiences 50 days of polar night from November 27th through January 15th, when the sun never appears above the horizon. North Cape stretches that to 67 days, and even southern Denmark gives you only 7 hours of weak daylight at the winter solstice. Arriving in Viking Age Norway in December meant facing degrees in a world where the sun had disappeared weeks ago and would not return for weeks more. You are already dying, which means you need shelter immediately. Vikings built some of the most impressive wooden structures in medieval Europe. The longhouse at Borg in the Lofoten Islands stretched 83 m long, which is greater than the length of a Boeing 747, and housed an entire chieftains. household along with their livestock, which lived at one end because their body heat helped warm the building. Longhouses ranged from 15 to 75 m in length with walls of timber or wattle and daub or turf over a meter thick, and every one of them centered on a hearth, an open fire burning directly on the dirt floor with no chimney above it. Smoke rose into the roof space and filtered out through gaps in the thatch, slowly and not always completely. Experimental archaeologists built 2 replica Viking houses based on 870 CE Hedeby designs in Denmark in 2011, and inhabited them for 15 weeks during winter while measuring everything they could. Average indoor temperature held at 15 to 17 degrees C, roughly 10 degrees above outdoor temperature, which sounds livable until you consider the heat distribution. The fire-facing side of your body could reach 50 degrees, while the side turned away stayed cold, meaning you were simultaneously overheating and freezing. Maintaining even this required 50 kg of dried hardwood burned every single day, 110 lb of fuel per house, and the labor of cutting, hauling, splitting, and drying that much wood represented a survival challenge all on its own. And that's where the air quality enters the picture. The particulate matter inside those houses measured between 0.8 and 3.4 mg per cubic meter, while the World Health Organization's 24-hour guideline sits at 0.025. The air inside a Viking longhouse exceeded safe limits by a factor of 30 to 130. Carbon monoxide reached 22 parts per million against a WHO recommendation of 6. After spending just 1 week in these conditions, the researchers found their lung function had measurably declined, and Vikings spent entire lifetimes breathing this air. Shelter kept you alive, but slowly poisoned your lungs, and that still ranked better than being outside because outside is where the sea waited. Vikings routinely crossed the North Atlantic in open boats through water that held summer surface temperatures of roughly 0 to 5 degrees C. The coastline off Stad, on Norway's west coast, earned a reputation as a graveyard of countless ships with storm waves reaching 15 to 18 m. That reputation held in August 2024, when the Viking replica ship Nadod capsized off Stad in 16 ft waves and killed American archaeologist Carla Dana. And that happened with modern safety equipment aboard. The sagas carried a specific word for being lost at sea in fog and storms, Hávamál, and it ranked among the most dreaded fates a Norse sailor could face, not because drowning came quickly, but because it often did not. Surviving the night indoors still left the problem of mourning, or whatever passes for mourning when the sun has not risen in 6 weeks. Now you need to eat. Viking winter diet amounted to a master class in creative desperation. Most stockfish meant cod gutted and wind-dried on wooden racks until it reached the approximate texture of a plank. Meat went into vats of sour whey, where the lactic acid kept it from rotting. Smoked fish hung in the rafters of the longhouse, which was convenient because the smoke doing the preserving was the same smoke damaging your lungs. Fermented dairy products like skyr and sour milk rounded things out, and barley filled every remaining gap, ground into porridge or baked into flatbread day after day for months on end. A nutritional analysis using modern dietary software attempted to reconstruct what this diet actually delivered, and the result came to roughly 1,200 calories per day, which is starvation level by any standard. Reaching 3,000 calories, as which the researchers described probably the minimum required for good health given the active lifestyle, demanded approximately a pound each of meat, dairy, and grain, consumed every single day. And even 3,000 calories earned the professional assessment of being probably insufficient to cover daily energy expenditures during some of the year, which is academic language for the fact that you are starving, and the math simply does not work. Bones tell the rest of the story. Skeletons from an 11th century cemetery in northern Iceland show porotic hyperostosis, spongy-pitted bone that signals chronic anemia, and isotope analysis of Greenland Norse remains tracked diets shifting from terrestrial food to marine food over generations. Seals comprised up to 80% of caloric intake by the settlement's final centuries. And skeletons from the last cemetery at Herjolfsnes measured significantly smaller than earlier burials, meaning the population was literally shrinking across generations. The Arab traveler Al-Tartushi visited the Viking trading town of Hedeby around 965 and wrote that the town is poor in goods and riches, and that people eat mainly fish. He also recorded that babies were thrown into the sea for reasons of economy, and scholars still debate whether that reflects actual Norse practice of infant exposure or the cultural shock of an outsider encountering something he misunderstood. But either way, it made the history. Cal record, ale brewed from malted barley and flavored with bog myrtle and juniper served as the primary daily beverage because hops had not arrived yet, and mead, fermented honey, a stayed reserved for feasts and special occasions. Water came from springs and streams, which sounds acceptable until you learn that at Jorvik, Viking Age York, backyard waste raised the ground level by about 1 cm per year between 900 and 935, and wells sat next to latrines with the same groundwater serving both purposes, which leads us directly to what was living inside you. But here's the thing. Everything described so far, the cold, the darkness, the toxic air, the starvation rations, the contaminated water, all of that only covers the environmental threats. We have not yet arrived at the parasites, the diseases, the violence, or the fact that Viking law provided a mechanism for a complete stranger to force you into a fight to the death with no legal way to refuse. All of that is still coming, and you want to stay for it. Your intestines are first. Archaeologists working beneath a Lloyd's Bank branch in York in 1972 unearthed the largest intact fossilized human feces ever recovered, 20 cm long and 5 cm wide, dating to the Viking Age, and it contained several hundred parasitic eggs, including whipworm. That find was not unusual. Excavations across Viking Age sites at Viborg, Birka, Ribe, and York have turned up whipworm, roundworm, liver fluke, tapeworm, and fish tapeworm in virtually every settlement layer examined. A study covering 589 medieval graves found roundworm infection in approximately 40% of individuals, and a 2022 University of Copenhagen study genetically mapped whipworm DNA from fossilized eggs in Danish Viking settlements dating back 2,500 years. You did not avoid these parasites in the Viking world. You hosted them, and they were as permanent a feature of your body as your bones. Your teeth come next. A 2023 University of Gothenburg study examined 3,293 teeth from 171 individuals buried at Viking Age Varnhem in Sweden, and found cavities in 49% of the population, while 62% of adults carried at least one carious lesion. A follow-up CT scan study of 15 Viking skulls revealed periapical inflammatory disease, meaning abscesses at the root of the tooth in 80%, along with periodontal disease in 67% and chronic sinusitis in 20%. Most Vikings reached death missing several teeth, according to the National Museum of Denmark. And yet over 130 examples of deliberately filed teeth have been identified across the Norse world, meaning they carved decorative grooves into teeth that were already falling apart. Vanity, it turns out, does not require dental health. Beyond the parasites in teeth came tuberculosis, confirmed through skeletal evidence at Sigtuna in Sweden, and leprosy with prevalence in certain Schleswig medieval cemeteries ranging between 9 and 44%. A 2019 study confirmed that Vikings carried leprosy to Ireland as 2 skeletons in Dublin bore distinct Scandinavian and Middle Eastern strains of the disease. Without antibiotics, any opening in the skin represented a potential death sentence, whether it came from a scratch, a blister, or an animal bite, because sepsis could turn a minor wound fatal within days. What Viking medicine existed, but its most well-known technique functioned as a diagnostic for whether you were going to die. A healer would prepare porridge from leeks and herbs and feed it to a wounded warrior, then lean in and smell the wound. Leek smell rising from the wound meant the stomach had been perforated, and that meant the patient was left to die. At the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, a warrior named Thormod Kolbrunarskald refused the leek porridge, had an arrow pulled from his chest by a woman working with tongs, studied the blood and flesh clinging to the arrowhead, and announced, "See how well the king keeps his men. There is fat by my heart." Before dying, that counted as a good death. Life expectancy numbers strip away any remaining illusions. Well, the National Museum of Denmark puts it plainly. Infant mortality was high, and the Vikings rarely reached 35 to 40 years of age, and only a few people lived until they were over the age of 50. 50% of adult men at Jorvik died between ages 21 and 30, almost certainly from warfare, while 35% of women failed to survive past 30, predominantly from childbirth. Reaching age 60 placed you in the top 1 to 3% of the entire population, a walking statistical anomaly with a body full of parasites and half your teeth gone. And none of that accounts for the violence, which saturated every level of Viking society. When researchers examined Viking Age Norwegian skeletal remains, they found weapon-related trauma in 72% of males, not warriors specifically, but males in general, meaning that being cut by a weapon represented a majority experience, rather than an occupational hazard. 42% of females showed the same type of injuries. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who interred Viking traders on the Volga River in 921, observed that every ruse man carried an axe, a sword, and a knife, and never parted from any of them, with swords of the Frankish variety featuring broad, ridged blades. Weapons functioned as clothing rather than equipment. Blood feuds spiraled across decades without resolution. Enjal's saga names 649 characters and follows a personal dispute that escalates until an entire family burns alive inside their own home. Formal resolution came through holmgang, the judicial duel, or fought on an ox hide, roughly 3 m across with alternating strikes and 3 shields per combatant. Refusing a holmgang challenge earned you the designation Nidinga, which amounted to social death. Berserkers exploited this system as legalized robbery, challenging men for their land, their property, and their wives, and the abuse grew so severe that Iceland banned holmgang in 1006 with Norway following in 1014. Even the Vikings eventually decided legalized murder robbery had crossed a line. Now, picture yourself as none of these people. You carry no kin connections, no allies, no legal standing. And in a society that granted personhood through family, you are nobody. Capture turned you into a thrall, the Viking term for a slave, and somewhere between 10 and 25% of Viking Age Scandinavian society lived in bondage. As Norwegian legal texts assigned the neuter gender to thralls, not he or she but it. Ownership of property, inheritance, and legacy were all forbidden. Isotope analysis reveals thrall diets built primarily around fish, while their owners consumed meat and dairy. Thralls slept in the darkest corners of the longhouse alongside the animals, and the Eddic poem Rigsthula assigned them names like Drengr, meaning stinky, and Heimskr, meaning stupid, names preserved in verse for every generation to read. Anna Kjellström of Stockholm University examined graves where slaves had been interred alongside their masters and found that most bore evidence of abuse, injury, and decapitation before burial. Iron shackles and slave collars have turned up at Dublin, Birka, and Hedeby, always clustered near harbors and points of sale. As in DNA analysis has demonstrated that 2/3 of Iceland's female founding population carried Gaelic origins, having been taken from Ireland and Scotland, rather than choosing to emigrate. Ibn Fadlan left an eyewitness account of a ruse Viking ship funeral on the Volga in 921, describing a slave girl selected to die alongside her dead master. After 10 days of preparation, she received intoxicants. 6 men entered the tent and assaulted her, and a woman known as the Angel of Death simultaneously strangled her with a rope and drove a blade between her ribs, while other men beat their shields to cover the sounds she made. The ship burned after that. Ibn Fadlan recorded every detail. His manuscript survived the centuries, and what he described is not mythology, but testimony. Beyond the settlement walls, beyond the longhouse and the harbor, for wolves roamed in numbers large enough that medieval Norwegian and Swedish laws actively encouraged citizens to kill them. The Old Norse word for wolf, vargar, became synonymous with outlaw in the legal system. And if society cast you out, you became a wolf, which tells you precisely how they viewed both creatures. Brown bears covered the entire Scandinavian peninsula during this period. Polar bears reached Iceland on drift ice from Greenland, with roughly 600 to 700 sightings recorded since settlement began. And the medieval Icelandic law code, Gragaz, contained special provisions allowing polar bear hunts, even on holy days, because apparently even divine authority made exceptions for animals that could kill 8 people in a single encounter, which is exactly what happened at Hornstrandir in 1321, and again at Skagafjörður in 1518. Let's now step back from every detail and hold the full picture. You are standing inside a longhouse on a winter night in 10th century Norway. The sun disappeared weeks ago and will not reappear for weeks more. Temperatures outside have dropped past -20 and continue falling. Your shelter holds 17 degrees on a good day and fills your lungs with air that would fail every modern safety standard by orders of magnitude. You have consumed your 1,200 calories of stockfish and barley porridge. Whipworm inhabits your intestines. Several of your teeth are abscessed, and one has been aching for months. The man sitting across the hearth carries a scar on his face and another along his forearm, and 72% of the men around you bear similar marks from bladed weapons. You hold no family connections here, no legal protection, no antibiotics, and no path home. Stepping outside to relieve yourself starts the hypothermia clock at 10 minutes, and wolves may be waiting in the dark. The Hávamál, the Norse wisdom poem attributed to Odin, opens with this instruction. At every doorway before walking through, you must look around. You must peer around, for one cannot know where enemies are sitting inside. That was stanza 1, the very first lesson, and it amounts to a warning to check for threats before you enter any room. Stanza 3 delivers the rest. Fire is needed by the newcomer whose knees are frozen numb, and food and clothing are needed by the one who has wandered over the mountains. That is not poetry, but a survival checklist. And in the Viking world, every item on that list represented a luxury that could be stripped away at any moment by cold, by violence, by disease, or by the simple mathematics of a food supply that never quite balanced. Norse settlers reached Greenland around 985, and at its peak, the colony supported roughly 2,500 people across 620 farms. They raised churches and traded walrus ivory and endured for 450 years. Then the climate turned against them. Lake sediment cores record a 4 degrees temperature drop over just 80 years. Skeletons grew smaller with each generation. Diets narrowed to almost nothing but seal. The last written record from Norse Greenland describes a wedding at Hávamál Church on September 16, 1408. After that date, silence. No more letters arrived. No more ships departed. Nothing remained. Archaeologist Thomas McGovern described the outcome in 3 words. This was extinction. An entire branch of Norse civilization vanished, not through conquest or invasion, but through cold and starvation and the slow, grinding pressure of a world that never stopped trying to kill the people who lived in it. The same forces that erased that colony over centuries would have finished you in a single night. The Hávamál understood all of this from the beginning. Stanza 77 reads, cattle die, kinsmen die. The self must also die. But I know one thing that never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds. They knew nothing lasted, not warmth, not food, not family, not your own heartbeat. And they sailed into the North Atlantic anyway, settled an island of volcanic rock and ice, and called it home, but reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus set foot on a ship, and accomplished all of it with the full understanding that the average member of their civilization would not live to see 40. The next time you find yourself warm and fed and safe and bored, complaining about something that carries no real weight, remember what the Hávamál describes in stanza 81. For these things give thanks at nightfall. The day gone, a guttered torch, a sword tested, the troth of a maid, ice-crossed, ale drunk. Give thanks at nightfall because for a Viking, reaching nightfall carried only one meaning. You survived another day. And in their world, across every frozen mile of it, that outcome was never once guaranteed.